Good afternoon, everyone. On this occasion, it is a pleasure to meet all of you. Allow us to introduce ourselves. My name is Nur Arifah, and my friend is Bilqis Sofiana. We are students of Quranic Studies and Exegesis from Indonesia, and currently we are joining a short course program at University of California, Riverside for about 3 months. And today we would like to present our paper entitled Local Stylistic in Al-Azhar Exegesis, Bridging the Quran and the Culture of the Indonesian Archipelago. Next, Quranic interpretation is human effect influenced by the interpreter's background, such as education, social context, and school of thought. Therefore, interpretation is subjective and open to renewal. So renewal in interpretation is important so that Quranic remain relevant in responding to the issue of every era, in line with the principle of Salihul Kulli Zaman wal Makan. And reformist idea in Quranic interpretation from the Middle East, such as the talk of Muhammad Abduh, inspired Indonesian scholar to adapt an interpretation to social change. Through Tafsir al-Azhar, Hamka present an interpretation combines with local perspective and Indonesian social cultural realities with the universal value of Islam. And the question is, how does Hamka's Tafsir al-Azhar reflect Indonesian local stylistic and Indonesian identity in Quranic interpretation? Okay, so now let's get to know Buya Hamka. Buya Hamka full name was Haji Abdul Malik Karim Amullah, or known as Buya Hamka. So the title Buya means our father in Arabic, Abi. Taken by Arabic language, Abun or Abi. This title is a honorific title in Minangkabau culture. So Indonesia have many ethnic groups, and one of them is Minangkabau. So, and about Buya Hamka, he was born in Mollet, one area in Indonesia, Maninjau, West Sumatra on February 16, 1908. And about his educational background, Hamka studied at Sekolah Desa when he was a child, Sumatera Tualib at Dunia School. Not only about that, he also learned many subjects independently, especially philosophy, literature, history, and sociology. And Hamka was known as highly productive writer because he wrote more than 103 works, covering Quranic interpretation, religion, history, and popular literary works. Because of his great reputation for knowledge and contribution to Indonesia, the story of his life and struggle was later adapted into a film, and we can watch it on Netflix. Okay, there is part 1 and part 2. Next. Okay, and history of the writing of Tafsir al-Azhar. Tafsir al-Azhar originally came from a series of regular dawn lecture at Al-Azhar Mosque, Kebayoran Baru, Indonesia, starting in 1959. And this tafsir was written to strengthen Islamic understanding among young Indonesia who have limited ability to understand Arabic, and also to help preachers prepare religion material that were easy for public to understand. And the writing of Tafsir al-Azhar began intensively in 1162 and was complete when Hamka was in prison from 1164 to 1167, so around 2 or 3 years. And this tafsir was written completely in Indonesia, covering 3 juz in Quran, and was published in several formats. For the first edition was published in 15 volumes, and the last edition, or until now, was published in 9 volumes. And there's the old first version and the new version, black color. So next, to method and style of interpretation in Tafsir al-Azhar. So Tafsir al-Azhar used the Tahlil method. Hamka explained Quran verses from Surah Al-Fatihah to Surah An-Nas. So Surah Al-Fatihah is the first verse in Quran, and Surah An-Nas is the last verse in Quran. And next, this tafsir mainly characterized by the adab ijtimai approach, which emphasizes literary, cultural, and social aspect. And about the sources, Hamka combines various sources, including Quran, Hadith, opinion of companions and tabi'in, and then poetry, classical verse, and about his personal experience. At last, methodological Tafsir al-Azhar was strongly influenced by Tafsir al-Manna by Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Ridho. And the next explanation about Tafsir al-Azhar will deliver by my friend. Thanks to her.
Alright, changing of the person, but we're still talking about the same thing. I'm just continuing what she is talking about. Now we are talking about this local stylistic in Tafsir al-Azhar, in Quranic interpretation al-Azhar, because Hamka in his writing is very Indonesian. Like, you can feel the Indonesian feel in his writing. That is what I call local stylistic. Stylistic is basically the study of language style, the style in which the author choose to use in his writing. And local stylistic means that his local aspect is influencing his writing in al-Azhar, in his work in Quranic interpretation. So what we found in his local stylistic, that the first is like he used also regional language perspective. For your information, in Indonesia we have so many regional language. Regional language is not Bahasa Indonesia. Indonesian language is not regional language, but regional language is the language we use in where we were born. There are so many places in tribes. Each tribe has its regional language, and Hamka also used that in his writing. For example, Hamka explained Arabic terms through Indonesian regional language. The word ilah means God. When Hamka explained God, he also used like Javanese language, one of the regional language. The language is like Gusti Allah in Javanese. So in Sundanese is Pangeran, and in Bugis, Makassar, Poam Allah Ta'ala. This shows that even in his tafsir works, in his works about Quranic interpretation, we also can see Indonesian reality, that Indonesia is multicultural, there are so many races, there are so many tribes, and he also included it in his tafsir works. So the second local stylistic found in Tafsir Al-Azhar is the use of other religious perspective. So in explaining Islam, he also compare it to other religions. For example, Hamka compares Islamic concept with concept from other religions in explaining the oneness of God. The oneness of God, there is some similar concept in Hinduism, which is Samkhayang Vidhi. He also used that to explain the oneness of God. And also in Christianity, the concept of Trinity, he kind of compared that to Christianity, the concept of Trinity, and this also reflects the multicultural part of Indonesia, that Indonesia is also multi-religious, and how the practice of religion, of many religion, is practiced openly in Indonesia at that time. And then the third local stylistic we found is that Hamka also used like his personal view of what happened in Indonesia at that time, the social contextualization of Indonesian reality. For example, when he interpreted the verse about khamar. Khamar is like alcoholic beverage, and it's forbidden in Islam, right? When he explained about that, he also talked about how the Dutch is the one who introduced khamar, who introduced alcoholic beverage in Indonesia, and this also shows that colonialism also happening there when he write his works. And also his view that the Dutch is like the enemy, and he is the one who like influenced Indonesian to weaken their morality, to weaken their social aspect. So this is also part of his personal view, and how he see also the Dutch, how he see colonials, and how he see the alcoholic beverage. So tafsir is in his work we can also see the reality of Indonesia at that time, and also his personal view. So in conclusion, Tafsir Al-Azhar is not merely a textual interpretation of the Quran, even though it's about Quran, it's about Islamic interpretation, but it also reflects Indonesian reality. So Hamka incorporates local language, regional languages, Indonesian social realities, and the multicultural context of Nusantara. Nusantara is another term of Indonesia. And then this local stylistic is what makes Tafsir Al-Azhar is very unique and has unique standpoint that is very distinctive and different than any other tafsir works. Yeah, I think that's. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We're going to have about 15 minutes at the end of our 3 presentations for questions. So we're going to move on to our next one, presented by Ahmad Fadel Rismari Putra from the University of PTIQ, presenting Constructing the Enemy in Print, Genealogy, Actors, and Discursive Shifts in Anti-Shia Literature in Indonesia from 1995 to 2025.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I present about constructing the enemy in print, genealogy, actors, and discursive shifts in anti-Shia literature in Indonesia. So we dive deep to Indonesian Muslim sects. It's like a sectarianism issue in Indonesia from 3 decades backwards, from 1995 and 2025. This presentation, you look, there is a in Islam there is no one view dominance in Indonesia. In Islam, there is a two sects, majority sects in Islam. It is Ahlus Sunnah and Shia. And in Indonesia, the most population Muslim is Ahlus Sunnah, and then after 1977 revolution in Iran, several Shi'i ideas, notions come into Indonesia and shifting the discourse, religious discourses in Indonesia. And then there is many literatures about anti-Shia from religious leaders. So there, I just want to say that Islam is not a mono-dimensional view. There is a Shia, there is a Ahlus Sunnah, there is many others sects. Okay. The problem that trigger my research is, according to the Pew Research Center, the Shia population in Indonesia constitute less than 1% of the total population. However, the volume of literature produced to counter the Shia presence far exceeds the actual size of the population. This situation strikes one as rather peculiar and unusual, particularly to a Western audience that accustomed to Christian homogeneity and principle of freedom of expression. In Indonesia, the relatively small Shia population has surprisingly have a significant impact within certain circle of the reformist intellectual community, largely due to the translation of books concerning the Iranian Revolution into the Indonesian language. Indeed, Amin Rais, who served as one of the chairperson of the People's Consultative Assembly (MPR) in the late 1990s, even penned the foreword for a book by Ali Shariati, a prominent intellectual figure of the Iranian Revolution. There is an intersection between religion, between this anti-Shia literature and Reformation movement in Indonesia in 1998. The second issue I have identified, drawing upon the work of Zulkifli and Brynison, is the assertion articulated in the writing that the Dewan Dakwah Indonesia, or Indonesian Council for Islamic Propagation, receives sponsorship from Saudi Arabia to publish anti-Shia literature. The Dewan Dakwah Indonesia is in essence a mass-based Islamic organization. From this vantage point, I observe that the presence of such sponsorship exacerbates the chaotic nature of sectarianism. However, my reason for examining these anti-Shia books published over the last 30 years is that monolithic few issue that come up from this book. Most researchers studying anti-Shia movement have overlooked a crucial aspect: how is the literature produced and how has it evolved over time. There is two important research about Shi'i in Indonesia. The first from Zulkifli. He writes the struggle of Shi'i in Indonesia. He identifies three distinct phases regarding the arrival of Shiism in Indonesia. The first happened through descendants of the Sayyid class from the Arab world, who had been Shia from the very outset. The second involved Indonesian students returning home after they are studying at seminaries in Qom, specifically Hauza Ilmiah. The third phase is a student activist inspired by the events of 1979 Iranian Revolution. Zulkifli identifies several important figures like Hussein Al-Abshi, Hussein Sahab, and Jalwin Rahmat as key Shia figures in Indonesia. He portrays the Shia communities as engaged in a desperate struggle, facing significant hardships. However, his study does not explore how the production of anti-Shia literature actually takes place. Another significant study and then the second, Sejarah dan Budaya Shia Indonesia, which is Shia history and culture in Southeast Asia. This work presents substantial material evidence of the Shia presence throughout Southeast Asia, including in Indonesia. It specifically challenged the prevailing thesis that Shiism arrived in the region only in the wake of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, but it was present before 1979. Because I view sectarianism as a fundamentally political ideological issue, I posit that beneath the surface of the published books and the specific language employed within them lie underlying efforts toward political domination and the manipulation of fear. In my preliminary research, I identified 50 books published between 1995 and 2020 that address the alleged deviance, heretic of Shiism or advocate for its rejection. I therefore pose the following questions. Is there a discernible connection among the various actors involved in writing and publishing these books? Furthermore, how do specific historical events such as 1997 gathering at Istiqlal Mosque, there is 900 scholars across Indonesia gather in the biggest mosque in Indonesia, Masjid Istiqlal, only to discuss in 1997, only to discuss is he a heretic or not, and can we accept this group, this kind of view, and this sect? And as you can observe, the covers of these anti-Shia books are not merely dominated by the color red, the color of blue. However, the language employed is rather alarming. Titles such as Jews, Shia, and Antichrist, Shia and Dajjal establish a link between the Shia, the Jewish people, and the Antichrist. Other titles characterize the Shia as a Jews export. The authors attempts to demonstrate that the Shia do not constitute a branch of Islam, but rather a group deliberately fabricated by the Jews. It is not my intention here to pass judgment on the veracity or falsity, the true or the wrong of these titles and their contents. Rather, I am examining the sentiments being cultivated and the manner in which this literature is produced, specifically in terms of its underlying discourse. One might also encounter titles such as Shia heresy upon heresy, heresy above the heresy. Interestingly, upon reading these books, one finds that the issue raised are not particularly novel. Topics such as it is a repeating issue in the contents of this book. Topics such as the historical figure of Ibn Saba, the disparagement of the Prophet's companion, or claims regarding the incompleteness of the Quran. Okay, of the 49 books I identified, I was able to confirm that no fewer than 20 books belong to a fast Salafi network, specifically one that leans towards Saudi style Salafism or Salafi jihadism. Furthermore, in 2013, a publication by the Indonesian Ulama Council (MUI) titled "Mengenal dan Mewaspadai Penyimpangan Syiah, Recognizing and Guarding Against or Worry Against Shia Deviations," marked a turning point. Whatever initially to be merely a doctrinal defense evolved into a process of securitization. However, unlike other Islamic legal rulings issued by the MUI, this specific ruling or book was published by a private entity named Al-Qalam under the umbrella of the publisher Gema Insani, which at the time was also actively publishing various individual anti-Shia titles. So, the publisher of this MUI books, which is like mass Islamic organization, is published by private publisher Al-Qalam under Gema Insani. And then the 3 discursive pieces. After a look in these 50 books, reading these contents and the way they write, the actors and the event relating to the books, I divide anti-Shia discourse into 3 major pieces. The first pieces is theological and doctrinal discourse. It is before 2006. In this phase, the books focus mainly on creed, ritual, and theology. The language assumed that readers needed to be taught what was considered theologically incorrect. So the discourse was educational and doctrinal in tone. And then the second phase is securitization from around 2006 until 2015. This is where the language changed dramatically. We began to see words such as danger, threat to the nation, expansion, virus, octopus, and blocking infiltration. Shia was no longer presented only as a theological deviation. It was framed as a political and national security threat. This shift is very important because it connected sectarianism with nationalism and state stability. The third phase is digitalization and fragmentation from 2016 until today. Interestingly, the number of printed books decreased significantly. In this period, social media became the primary vehicle of sectarian discourse, primary medium of the sectarian discourse. Instead of long books, narratives, we throw the TikTok videos, YouTube clips, Instagram posts, podcasts, and other mediums. Authority also become more fragmented, and discourse was centralized through publisher and organization, and anyone can produce sectarian content online. What I want to contribute is to shift the discussion from conflict itself toward the infrastructure that produces sectarianism. Most previous studies focus on violence, theology, or ethnography, but I argue that print culture itself become an infrastructure for constructing sectarian identity. Here I borrow Benedict Anderson's concept of print capitalism. Just as print helped create nationalism, sectarian publishing also helped manufacture religious boundaries and imagine enemies. This means sectarianism is not simply spontaneous hatred, it is produced through network institution, publishers, political lectures, and media systems. This is important for policymakers, I think. If the government or digital platform treats sectarianism as only an emotional or spontaneous problem, interventions will not be effective. We must understand the supply chain behind sectarianism discourse. And to conclude, anti-Shia discourse in Indonesia has evolved from theology to securitization and finally into digital fragmentation. Publishing networks played a central role in shaping these narratives over the last 3 decades. Understanding these networks helps us better understand how sectarian identities are constructed in modern Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. We'll have our last presentation by Michelina Hilma from the University of PTIQ, presenting colonial inspirations and the emergence of performative Islamic arts among Minangkabau women.
Good afternoon, everyone. Still fresh scholars. Okay. My name is Solina Hilma. I am a PhD student of PTIQ of Jakarta, Indonesia. So this is my presentation, or this is my idea about colonial inspiration. Just now, my friend Afifa, she told us about Minangkabau. Minangkabau is the tribe. That is my tribe, actually. That's my ethnic. I come from the Minangkabau is one tribe of Sumatran people, or West Sumatra in Indonesia. So this we gonna see the maybe a bit noise. Sorry. Okay. Actually, this is the video about West Sumatra. West Sumatra.
Oh, videonya di sini.
Iya.
Coba.
This. Iya.
Just like-
Cannot. No.
Oh, kanan.
Ya, tapi ini ada tombol. Kan. Works. This is perguruan dunia. Perguruan is school. Dunia school in Padang Panjang. Belum Padang. So, I will tell you about colonial inspiration and the emergence of performative Islamic arts among Minangkabau women. This is my duty to tell you about Minang women in Indonesia, Sumatra, in West Sumatra. Okay. So this is surau. Surau is mosque. Surau is the meditation place in early Minang, established in 17th century. So this is surau. The before colonial inspiration. Okay. I will break. The surau, how about surau? Nah, the surau, the figure that I the figure in the prominent figure in Minangkabau, or the women prominent figure in Minangkabau, is Rahma El Yunusia. Rahma El Yunusia has the school, she built the school in Padang Panjang in West Sumatra. Before she built the school in 1923, she studied from her father, and the teacher of her father. So after that, she studied in Surau. This is the Surau. So this so ethnic and so early, or so classic almost. So before when she looks about the women in her era in 17th century, that in 20th century, that women, most of them didn't most of them who neglected her children. So because the education, or because the less of education, so Rahma Yunusia built the school in her era. So before we continue to Rahma Yunusia, let's see Indonesian school comes from Dutch or colonial, like this quick school. So in the middle of women, Indonesian women was Dutch women. So this is the inspiration of Rahma El Yunusia built or emerged she built the school from the colonial inspiration. The colonial inspiration comes from the Dutch. I'm so sorry, my English is so basic, but I still try to describe you what's the women in Sumatra, West Sumatra, Indonesia, survive by education. Okay, Rahmat, she was born in 1900 and until 1969. So she has the privilege that she was born in the good family, and she was born in the good family, in the religious family. Her father is scholar, and her grandfather scholar as well. So after that, she inspired by seeing how Dutch people built the school in Minangkabau in West Sumatra. So she tried to maybe imitate, but this is not imitate, just adopt the colonial system. So after that, this is the school Minangkabau. Women, all of them is women. There is no the male or of the female until now. Until today, this school occupied by female there and no male. So after that, this. Now in the middle of hijabers of the hijab women, in the middle of them is Rahma Yunusia, and at the right side and the left side of Rahma Yunusia is the Al Azhar institution Al-Azhar apa ya pejabatnya? Then they come from Al-Azhar University in 1955. In 1955, they recognize her school. Both of them recognize her school in 1955. This school. Okay. So the next. Now this is and at the last of until now, this school until today still still runs. And the middle at the middle of female or at the middle of pinky female is the man who from embassy from U.S. embassy in Indonesia in Jakarta, who invite the female the student of Diniah Putri Rahma Indonesia to come for exchange student in U.S. until now. Yeah, so that's all of mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question for any of our presenters?
My question's for the last presentation. You were describing how everyone who's learning is a woman. I was wondering if all the teachers are also women.
Oh yeah. Okay, actually, all of the teacher are women, but the ustaz or the husband also teach. Yeah. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
This question is for Ahmad. So with the recent development of AI, do you see that being used in anti-Shia sentiments across Indonesia, or is that something that you have not really looked into yet because it's so recent?
I haven't looked to AI and check how AI see Shi'i and is Shi'i is one of the deviants or heretic sects in Islam, but I'm not an engineer of AI to see and to test the answer of AI and how AI produce about Shia, about Shia idea, about Shia creed, about Shia rituals, and then about Shia, how AI fuse Shia. But as long as I know, AI have a databases from he get it from Google, from many databases. As long as the databases is dominated by only one view, I think AI will answer based on this database. But I think AI is not. AI now, some AI like Claude has an ethical consideration to answer, like it is a deviance or heretic sect in Islam, or it is a wrong. As long as I use AI, I think I can answer.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions for our presenters?
I could just give some comments. So all these three papers are coming from local contexts, right? I think it would be, I think for more conversation with the wider, academia and scholarships should also be brought into more global academic conversations. How to make local context also conversable and comparable or to other contexts as well beyond Indonesia, beyond specific areas like Minangkabau or Lombok or so just to give especially for the presenters to bring the conversation not only locals when we talk about Southeast Asia because it's so localized, but how about other contexts? Can we understand other contexts using local materials? That's just for the more productive conversation about the very local context of it. For example, notion of print culture or the anti-Shia literature. We can bring the discussion about Islamophobia industry, for example, right in the U.S. So give some most recent literature on particular topics that you're discussing, and then engage the literature in a more interdisciplinary context. Just some comments for others the presentation. So using the local materials into a global conversation. First, it's regional. In Southeast Asia, area studies will also bring into is it sociology, is it history, is it literature, is it performative or performance, literature, performance scholarship, and so on and so forth. Just some feedback to the other presenters. So fascinating, local, really fascinating. You don't have to respond. I just
Okay.
If you feel like you want to respond, please. How in other contexts, yeah. So because all very important, like women participation in education, right? Islamic arts, anti-Shia literature, all this are very localized, but at the same time very useful for broader conversation on the themes in different disciplines. That's my point.
Maybe I want to respond a little. I think the question is not only for us. It's all of the previous presenters which discussing about Vietnam, about Thailand, about Myanmar. They do with the region things, the cases in the region. But the research is useful if we can get the general concept why some actors or some humans do something, like why the actors of the publisher of anti-Shia literature do sentiments words like antichrist, Jews, and many other words. We can explain that and get the general rules and apply to another region maybe, or is there a similarity from Indonesian context and Vietnam context and USA context? But I think Indonesian is very different from USA in religious context. It is very diverse in Islam itself, in the tribe itself. In the U.S. citizen will not can understand Indonesian society, I think so, because Indonesia is very we live here, and 1 kilometer after here, we in Sulawesi we have a different language. We can communicate each other. There is one area in Indonesia. It's such a very diverse society, I think. So and by Indonesian context, we can critique others' theories that applies about plural theory, about human behavior in plurality. I think Indonesia is a unique society. That's I think you can get my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions for our presenters? Otherwise, we're gonna end a couple minutes early. Thank you everybody for coming today to our first day, or our second day of our C-Scrub conference.
I want to first thank all of the presenters, especially, you're at the end of the day, so I know everyone's a little tired. But thank you everybody for staying to listen to these wonderful presentations. And to every single presenter today, it was fantastic to hear all of you and just to get so much more knowledge about everyone else's research in Southeast Asia. It's very wonderful to hear. So I was so pleased to hear everyone's talk. We will be starting again tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll have coffee, tea, and water and other food out as well. And tomorrow we will have 3 panels as well as our guest speaker, Cindy Nguyen, coming in to talk to us about her research. We will also be having a reception tomorrow evening at Dr. Ali's house. If you need help with the ride over there, please let me know. We have a couple of different options available to help get everybody there for the reception, where we can continue to talk about everybody's research and have some really good food. And with that, yeah, I'll thank everybody. Oh, please.
Is it possible to share the slides with all the presenters? Because I'm going to be presenting my department, and so basically luckily I had a chance to get the slides and get some information. So taking this.
I can absolutely check in. Yeah, sure.
What was that?
She wanted to see if she could have some access to people's slides so I can
Share
know.
slides.
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I can send out a formal email to put everyone's slides into a Google Doc where I'll allow people to put them in if they so choose, just so everyone can, yeah, I'll do it that way, if that's okay with everybody. Wonderful. Well, I will dismiss everyone. There is still a couple of lunches in the back as well as some more food and drink. Feel free to take some with you as you leave today. And I hope to see everyone here again tomorrow for our presentations. Thank you.
Well done, everyone. Well done. Thank you.